The greatest problem of philosophy is philosophy, as featured in Belonging Again, on unstoppable, unrestricted, and self-consuming autonomous rationality, inspired by Samuel Barnes, particularly the iconoclast. The Conflict of Mind by O.G. Rose ended with a paper called Deconstructing Common Life, which focused on the work of David Hume and Donald Livingston, work that may prove useful for outlining problems articulated in Belonging Again. Philosophy here will primarily be defined as simply the act of reasoning. Basically, philosophy and reasoning will be treated as similes. This in mind, consider the following premises. First, philosophy can be about anything. Can you think of a subject that philosophers can't philosophize about? There's a philosophy of science, philosophy of relationships, philosophy of work. Every PhD is a philosophy of, after all. Anything can be material for philosophical consideration, meaning philosophy is unbound. Second, philosophy never ends. Few, if any, philosophical subject is ever exhausted. I'm hesitant to say that no philosophical answers exist, but I think it's fair to say that philosophy basically never ends. The great conversation that has been going on for thousands of years will likely continue for thousands more. Can we even imagine how to end the conversation about what is good? Seeing as every age presents new things to question, probably not. Third, philosophy can never provide its own grounding. Thinking can never provide its own axioms, meaning autonomous rationality is impossible. Rationality cannot be rational all the way down. Eventually, it must rest on premises and ideas of the true, which are ascribed to through non-rational means. Note, I didn't say irrational. This is a topic discussed throughout The Truism of the Rational, but it's hard to imagine a premise provided in thought that functions as an axiom for that very thought. Thought always falls into Gödel's incompleteness there. Fourth point, philosophy that tries to provide its own grounding consumes itself and takes everything it is absorbed into itself down with it. David Hume's great insight was that unbound rationality and/or unbound philosophy becomes a force of destruction. The true and the rational are not similes, and what constitutes the rational is relative to what we believe is true, which means rationality must come after truth. But how do we decide what's true then? By non-rational means, which could mean that rationality, which tries to ascribe to a truth only rational, would be an impossibility and ultimately prove itself as having nothing to do with the real world. But if this autonomous rationality still tried to have something to do with the real world, it would have to make the real world into its image versus conform itself to the real world. This would result in violence. And all that would occur would be that the autonomous rationality would increasingly discover its own impossibility. It would ultimately just eat itself, causing violence and destruction along the way. Hopefully, the works of O.G. Rose have justified all these premises, which altogether give us the following. Philosophy potentially never stops being about everything, nor does it ever stop attempting to self-justify itself, which means that philosophy can motivate everything into self-consumption and self-destruction. Hopefully, the works of O.G. Rose have justified all these premises, which altogether give us the following. Philosophy potentially never stops being about everything, nor does it ever necessarily stop attempting to self-justify itself, which means that philosophy can motivate everything into self-consumption and self-destruction. David Hume believed that philosophy's greatest problem was philosophy itself, for philosophy could unleash incredible violence upon the world. At the same time, Hume understood the answer wasn't to avoid philosophy entirely, for critical reasoning was necessary for people to defend themselves from tyrants, bad philosophy, and the like. Thoughtlessness was never the answer for Hume, the dangers of which Arden speaks on, but its counter of philosophy was also risky. What was needed was a full philosophical journey, but what is meant by this is explained in Deconstructing Common Life. Hume understood the answer was good philosophy, which was a rationality that ultimately deferred to common life. It was a rationality which embedded itself in the world versus stand over it judgmentally. It exercised itself in service of a particular way of life versus view all particular ways of life as subjective and therefore irrational. It tried to understand the world more than change it. Rationality in philosophy, which didn't serve common lives, would ultimately prove unstoppable and a force of destruction. Another language we could use to describe the problem is bound philosophy good and unbound philosophy bad. What binds philosophy? Well, givens, which unfortunately, though, can be a source of thoughtlessness and horrifying banality of evil. The hope is that good philosophy can keep givens from incubating social horrors, but there's always a risk present whenever there are givens. But as Hume argued, erasing givens unleashes bad philosophy, from which there can be no escape. Unbound philosophy won't stop until it consumes and destroys everything in its effort to be its own grounding, an effort at which it must ultimately fail. Philosophy is philosophy's greatest problem, and the solution is non-rational, non-philosophical givens, which is a solution that philosophy will find no philosophical justification to accept within itself. The justification must come from wisdom outside of rationality, from common life and lived experience, from good philosophy. Philosophy that helps us is philosophy that understands it isn't the end of all things. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram. For The Iconoclast by Samuel Barnes, which inspired this piece, please see his website. Please see Amazon. I also suggest Missing Axioms. And thank you so much for your time.